So I'm going to talk about the science behind changing school start times. And as Brooke noted, I'm going to start by just giving you an overview of sleep. Much of the information you may already know, but I think it's helpful to have certain terms that are understood by everybody that I'm going to use throughout the talk. Then I'm going to present 2 case studies of other schools that have switched school start times and specifically what their outcomes were. And then I'm going to go through those questions that Brooke replied and try to give answers to the best of my ability, or to the best, to the extent that the science will allow me to give a definitive answer. And then I'm really open for discussion and answering other questions. I do think it probably makes sense to save questions until the end. The exception would be if there's a clarification question, so you're not understanding something that I said, or you have a question about the methodology, something about that. I am willing to stop. So if you put it in the chat, I think Brooke said that she would keep an eye out on the chats for me. And so Brooke, feel free to interrupt me if you feel like there's something that should be clarified.
Nope, I will keep an eye on the chat and ask those questions as they come.
Okay, great. Okay, so as Brooke already said, so some of the questions I want to try to answer. When you make a switch in school start times, do adolescents actually get more sleep? And if so, what are the benefits that they experience? And does between 30 and 60 minutes of additional sleep really matter? Is that enough to see benefits? I also want to talk a little bit about alternative options, so other ways that one could address the problem of adolescents not getting enough sleep. I want to present the sort of limited evidence that we do have about how a change might affect younger children if younger children were to start school earlier than previously. And then talk a little bit about the barriers. And then I'm going to take a stab at answering this question as well, sort of the optimal times. Okay, so sleep 101. So sleep is a basic human drive, and there are 2 biological systems that are really important in determining when we feel tired and when we feel more alert throughout the day. So one of those is sleep-wake homeostasis. It's also sometimes called sleep pressure. It sounds really complicated, but it's a very simple concept, which is that the longer you're awake, the more tired you are. So when you wake up in the morning after a good night's sleep, your sleep pressure is pretty low and you don't feel tired. As the day progresses, as you're awake for longer and longer periods, you feel more tired. However, there is another system that is equally important that interacts with the sleep pressure system to help sort of dictate when we're more tired and when we're more alert, and that's the circadian rhythm system. So the circadian rhythm system is the internal clock that's in our brain that helps regulate when we feel sleepy, when we feel more alert, and it typically does this through the release of hormones like melatonin, among others, and also there are changes in sort of our core body temperature that occur on a circadian pattern. It's really important for both of those systems to be working together and functioning properly for us to be able to sleep at night and be awake during the day. So a little bit more about how these systems work together. So as I mentioned, this is you can see my pointer, right? Okay, great. So again, with the homeostatic drive, as I mentioned, in the morning when you wake up, your sleep pressure is low. It increases throughout the day. When you fall asleep, it gets lower and lower, and then it increases when you wake in the morning. The circadian system is a little bit more variable, but essentially when you wake in the morning, the circadian system is not necessarily promoting alertness. It doesn't have to, because your sleep pressure is so low. You just had a good night's sleep. And it sort of varies throughout the day and night. And essentially, what happens is the second half of the day, when our sleep pressure is higher because we've been awake for, say, 8 hours, our circadian system is kicking in and helping us to feel more alert. Otherwise, we'd be increasingly tired as the day progressed, and that's not necessarily what happens. I mean, we can still be functional and alert after dinner, even though we've been awake for quite some time, and that has to do with the circadian system sending us these alertness signals. So there's this really important period that's called the forbidden zone. And so that's an area where your circadian system is really kicking in to make you feel awake, typically a couple hours before you would fall asleep. So in a normal adult who tends to sleep from 10 to 6, those hours from say 6 to 8 or 9, your circadian system's really kicking in, and it's going to be harder to fall asleep then. And so that's going to be important when we talk about adolescent sleep. And then the other part of the circadian timing system that's really important and has implications for school start times is what's called the circadian nadir, or the circadian low point. And so that is typically about 2 hours before you wake up in the morning, you are having your deepest sleep. Their circadian alertness signal, you can see, is extremely low to help us stay asleep for the second half of the night. And so if you think about having to wake up to go to the airport, for example, at 3 a.m. or to wake for a baby, it's really difficult to wake at that time because it's during for most people, it's during their circadian nadir. It's really our deepest sleep period. And so when the circadian system is shifted, that really has implications for how easily we can fall asleep and wake up, and we'll talk more about that. Okay, so in addition to the sleep pressure system, with the circadian system, there's individual variability, and there's a really strong genetic component. So some people, just the way they're wired, they're more likely to be sort of morning types. Their best hours are in the morning. Some are more likely to be evening types, where they tend to do best in the evening. And so there are individual differences in chronotype. But also there are developmental changes in chronotype. So if you think about, as we go across development as an infant, I mean, infants are definitely larks. Well, not newborns, but young children are larks, right? So they do not like to sleep in typically, and they fall asleep earlier. Adolescents tend to be more owls. And then adults, we shift back a little bit. So we're sort of in the middle. And then actually in older age, you shift back to sort of a lark. So essentially, there are individual differences in chronotype. So we all come to the table with a tendency, but then there are also sort of normal changes that occur throughout development. Another thing that's important to understand about sleep is that the amount of REM sleep that we get, and REM is really important for learning, memory consolidation, increases proportionately during the night. So this is sort of a typical adult sleep pattern. So you can see in that first cycle of sleep, so like the first 90 minutes of sleep, this is how much REM a typical adult would have. Anybody want to guess? You can either unmute yourselves or put it in the chat. Like, what percentage of REM sleep are people getting in that first cycle? Probably about 15 or 20%, right? So of their sleep, only about 15 to 20% is REM. And as we progress throughout the night, the amount of REM that we get really increases. So if you look at the fifth cycle, which would typically be like the last cycle before you wake in the morning, what proportion is REM, do you think, of the fifth sleep period? I mean, it's more than half, right? Yeah, so it's much greater. And so when you have somebody who is chronically sleep deprived, so they're not finishing their sort of sleep period, they're going to miss out not just on sleep, but they're going to miss out on REM sleep, which really has implications for learning and memory. And I think that sort of explains why an extra 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes can make a big difference in sort of cognitive outcomes, because if you're sleeping an hour less than you're supposed to, you're not just missing out on sleep, you're missing out on REM sleep. Okay, so just briefly, healthy recommended sleep durations for school-age children, we're looking at between 9 and 12 hours, somewhere in that range. And for adolescents, the recommended range is between 8 and 10 hours of sleep. So talking a little bit about sleep in the school-age children, and when I say school-age, I mean elementary aged. So again, the recommended duration is 9 to 12 hours. This tends to be our least sleepy age group. So compared to, say, preschoolers and adolescents, school-age children don't tend to be as sleepy. Compared to adults, they're on an advanced circadian timing system, and so typically they are going to be waking earlier in the morning. So they're a little bit more towards that lark phase, and they're typically not going to sleep in. And there are lower rates of insufficient sleep. So, you know, depending on which study you're looking at and how they measure it, what population, probably in that like 20 to 30% of school-age kids are not getting enough sleep. So it's not that it's not a problem, but compared to adolescents, it's a smaller problem. Okay, so in terms of adolescent sleep, so again, the recommended duration is 8 to 10 hours. And most adolescents are sleep deprived, and I'll show you some data, although I'm guessing many of you probably don't need data to believe that. And again, much of the lost sleep is going to be that sort of high quality REM sleep. So during adolescence, there are changes to the circadian timing system, and we can measure this in terms of changes in core body temperature, in the release of certain hormones. Another change that happens is they actually become more sensitive to evening light as adolescents compared to younger children. Exposure to evening light will impact them more, meaning making it even harder to fall asleep. There are also some changes to the homeostatic or the sleep pressure system, where sleep pressure builds more slowly, and so they're just able to stay awake for longer periods more easily, and it takes them longer to fall asleep because of changes in sleep pressure. And so because of this, it is very difficult for a lot of teens to make themselves fall asleep earlier. And this phase delay, this delay in the circadian timing system, is associated with pubertal changes. So it's not necessarily age, but pubertal progression that predicts how delayed kids are in their sleep rhythm. So you can see a Tanner 1 is a prepubescent kid. The melatonin onset, which is an indicator of sort of readiness for sleep, is in that like 8 to 9 range. Tanner 5 is like a fully pubescent teenager, and you can see that it's much higher. So as people progress through different stages of puberty, they experience that delay. And this delay is seen in most mammals, a circadian delay around the time of whatever adolescence is for that animal. So it's not just a cultural phenomenon, although certainly there are sort of cultural and lifestyle contributors to a delayed circadian phase. We see this a lot in nature as well. And so again, what happens with adolescence is typically, on average, you're going to see sort of a natural bedtime or ability to fall asleep between 11 and 12, and a natural wake time between 8 and 9. And so what happens then is that in a lot of cases, we're asking adolescents to wake right around the time of their circadian nadir. So essentially, it would be hard to pick a more difficult time to wake a teen than between 6 and 7. Okay. So what about weekend sleep? So how does that play into this? Weekend sleep, weekend oversleep, so sort of making up for sleep that was missed during the week on the weekend, is pretty common. It's actually a marker of insufficient sleep. So if you've gotten good sleep all week, you're not going to sleep 11 hours on the weekend. That is the result of insufficient sleep during the week. But it doesn't really reverse or compensate for the loss. You can't really make up sleep. And so what happens is people are experiencing, or teens are experiencing, this social jet lag, where on days when they're not in school, they're shifting their bedtimes later, and they're shifting their wake time sometimes 5 or 6 hours later, right? So if they're getting up at 7 on school days, they may be getting up at noon on weekends. And this leads to what we call social jet lag, where there's a real mismatch between between different days, but also between their natural rhythms and sort of when they're sleeping and waking. And then in addition, if you're sleeping late on Sunday, it's going to be hard to fall asleep on Sunday night because the sleep pressure hasn't built sufficiently. And so the result is this sort of permanent state of jet lag, which is really not healthy for sleep, but also just for overall health and functioning. If you think about jet lag, on average, it takes about a day for each time to adjust to each time zone that you cross into. So if you're going, say, to Europe, 6 hours, in theory, it's going to take you about 6 days to be really, for your body to be fully adjusted. Adolescents essentially are going to Europe every weekend, a lot of them. So it's really unhealthy, essentially. Okay, so in addition to these biological changes, of course, you have changes in lifestyle, where increasingly parents are less focused on bedtime. There are more activities, more homework, sort of more social engagements, and as a result, that is also coming into play. And so you really have, the early school start times, the sort of habits and pressures, and the biology are all sort of coming together to create this epidemic of insufficient adolescent sleep. So in terms of the stats on insufficient sleep overall, this is the percentage of high school students who get sufficient sleep, who get the minimum amount that's recommended. And you can see that on average, it is about 25%. And this is a big survey that the CDC, the Center for, what does the CDC stand for? Anyway, the CDC does. The Center for Disease Control, thank you. So we're at about 25%. And this is a survey of about 50,000 teenagers across the US. You can see that males are a little bit more likely to get the sleep that they need, so it's a little bit worse for females. You can see that the amount of kids that are getting enough sleep decreases as kids progress throughout high school. And you can also see that there are some racial and ethnic disparities with Black and Hispanic teenagers even slightly more likely to have insufficient sleep, or lower rates of getting enough sleep. If you look at it by state, Indiana is really up there in sort of this highest bracket of about 76 to 82% of high schoolers are not getting enough sleep. And by the way, this is assessed by teenagers' reports of how much sleep they're getting. So it could potentially even be worse if kids, because there's a tendency to over-report the amount of sleep that we're getting. So what about middle schoolers? So I don't have a pretty graph for this one, but you can see that the rate of kids who are getting less than recommended sleep is about 61% for 6th graders, 59% for 7th graders, and 53% for 8th graders. And by the way, I'll share these slides through Brooke and Stephanie so that you can hold on to the data if you're interested. Okay, so what is the impact of insufficient sleep on adolescents? Okay, so maybe write it in the comments, and maybe Brooke or Stephanie can sort of tell me what you say, but let's think about, there are a lot of strengths that teenagers have and a lot of wonderful things, but for now, I'd like you to focus on what are some of the negative stereotypes about adolescence, some of the negative characteristics.
I can go ahead and moderate. So we have mood swings.
Yeah.
Rebellion.
Okay. Yeah.
Laziness.
Mm-hmm.
Poor choices. Peer pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Lack of focus. Anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you guys hit a lot of the ones that I usually get and that I have. I mean, moodiness, impulsive decision making, so sometimes not making the wisest decisions, low motivation or laziness, irritability, volatility. And how many of these do you feel might be associated with insufficient sleep? I mean, all of them, right? So in laboratory studies, we see, and these are studies in the laboratory where you bring kids in and actually restrict or extend their sleep, and they go through like a week of restricted sleep, a week of extended sleep, and they look at kind of different outcomes. And adolescents who have their sleep restricted, who are sleeping 30 to 60 minutes less than usual, have reduced verbal creativity, worse attention, lower ability to solve problems and reason, worse school performance, more negative emotions, particularly when challenged, more sleepiness, unhealthy food choices, and then risk-taking behavior. And we'll talk a little bit more about that one because that's important. So in adolescence, there's certain areas of the brain that are really important that in terms of risky behaviors for reward-related functions. So how excited do you feel when you get a reward? What kind of emotions do you have? How motivated you are? How much do you perceive the potential risk of your behavior? And there are a lot of changes that adolescents undergo that make them prone to impulsive decision-making and risk-taking. And studies suggest that insufficient sleep is linked to changes in this decision-making. And so in a sense, you have sort of the typical adolescent state. There's some difficulties with decision-making, and then that's exacerbated by insufficient sleep.
Dr. Honaker, we have one question around how can you differentiate between sleep deprivation and natural hormonal changes?
So natural hormonal changes have more to do with when you sleep, and sleep deprivation has, I see what you're saying, not about sleep, but just, yeah, I mean, you can't. I mean, I think that's a great point. So certainly not all of those negative negative characteristics can be attributed to sleep. No, I think that's a good point. The hormones most probably play a big role. I do that exercise because I would argue that we often underestimate the role of sleep in sort of the typical, negative characteristics of adolescence. Did that answer the question? Okay, so in terms of comparing, looking at risky behaviors, in gray, you see teens that are sleeping less than 8 hours, and in red, you see teens that are sleeping more than 8 hours. And you can see that for essentially each type of risky behavior that they considered, including sort of mood and risky behaviors, those who slept less than 8 hours were at higher risk pretty much across the board. So these gray bars are consistently higher than the red ones. Sort of other types of risk behavior. So this was another CDC survey of high school students. Those who slept less than 7 hours compared to those who slept 9 hours were less likely to use helmets, less likely to use seatbelts, more likely to text while driving, more likely to ride with a drinking driver, and more likely to drink and drive. some sort of more risk behaviors. Drowsy driving is a big concern. So about 50% of the fatigue-related traffic crashes involve teenagers and young adults. In a national poll, 2/3 of seniors indicated that they've driven while drowsy, and 15% say that they do it at least once a week. And we know that sleep loss impairments can be equal or greater than those due to alcohol intoxication. So in laboratory settings, you see that. Sleep loss is also associated with increased risk of pedestrian injuries in children, so getting hurt by crossing the street, more sports-related injuries, and a threefold risk of work-related injuries. So kids who are sleeping less than 8 hours are at higher risk for both risky behaviors and accidental injury. And so, not surprisingly, two of the three highest causes of death in this age group are unintentional injury, and that includes car accidents, and suicide. And of the sort of three highest causes of death in teenagers, two of them, unintentional injury and suicide, have been very consistently linked to insufficient sleep. Okay, so that's sort of the overview of sleep and adolescent sleep and the impact of insufficient sleep. And so now we're going to talk specifically about school start times. So I'm going to present two cases. There have been more than 40 research papers that have looked at changes that schools experience when they make this shift, but I'm just going to tell you about two just to give you sort of a sense of what we see. So this was an independent high school in Rhode Island, and they moved their start from 8 to 8:30, so just a 30-minute switch in this case. There was a 45-minute mean increase in total sleep time. So in this case, it was only a 30-minute delay, but there was a 45-minute increase in sleep time. No change in sleep onset. So essentially, kids were going to sleep about the same time, but they were able to sleep later. And the percentage of kids sleeping 8 hours or more increased from about 16% to 55%. So a lot of kids were impacted. They found reduced daytime sleepiness and fatigue. So even with the 30 minutes, the number of kids who reported they took a nap at least one day per week decreased from 52 to 36%. Reduction in depressed mood on a scale of depressive symptoms, and also fewer school nurse visits for fatigue-related complaints. And in the Rhode Island study, they did not find changes in grades. In Kentucky, so this was Fayette County, so Lexington area. They made a switch for both the middle and high schools from 7:30 a.m. start to 8:25, so just under an hour. Total sleep time on average increased by 50 minutes. So of the 55-minute switch, 50 of it resulted in sleep. And there was a 15% decrease in the automobile crash rate for 16 to 18-year-olds during that switch, despite an increase in other parts of the state in that age group. And that finding's been replicated in other case studies as well, that you do see fewer car accidents when school start times change. And in their case, similar to Rhode Island, the percentage of students getting at least 8 hours of sleep increased from 20 to 50%. Okay, so now we get to the questions, so the fun part. So we've already answered this a little bit with those two case studies, but let me give you more data. Do adolescents actually get more sleep when school starts later? So one thought is, well, maybe if school start an hour later, adolescents are just going to stay up an hour later, which really would defeat the purpose. So, and it's a valid question. So this is a review of about 38 studies on school start, and they found the following changes in adolescent sleep from comparing before the school start time change to after. So a later rise time, which makes sense. If school starts later, kids are getting up later. More sleep, less weekend catch-up sleep, less sleepiness, greater sleep satisfaction. I'm not honestly sure what that means, but yeah. So those are sort of some of the consistent findings about sleep. And this actually just was released a couple of weeks ago by JAMA, which is a really prestigious journal. And so in this one, they had 3 schools that were delayed start schools, and that's in orange. And you can see the 3 different time points, and here you see how much sleep the kids were getting on average. And so before the school start time, kids were getting between 7.5 and 7.75 hours. After the shift, the average went up to more than 8 hours, and that was maintained a year later. In the schools that were the comparison schools, where the school start time change stayed the same, kids got less sleep over time, which makes sense because you saw as kids progress through high school, they're getting less sleep. So if they were a 9th grader here and a 10th grader here, it would make sense that they would get less sleep. And then that was also maintained over time or got even worse. The really neat thing about this study is that the way that they measured sleep was not just by asking kids how much they were sleeping, but by measuring it through a tool called actigraphy, which is a wristband that you send kids home with for a 1 or 2 week period, and it gives an objective measurement of how much they're sleeping. Okay, so in answering that question, do adolescents actually get more sleep when schools start later? In my opinion, that is a definitive yes. Yes, they do. Okay, so next question. What are the benefits, and does 30 to 60 minutes of additional sleep really matter? And again, we've seen some of the benefits in the case studies, but we'll go over them sort of more in a summary way. So in terms of outcomes in school performance, so this was a really large study that looked at school administrative records, pre and post changes for several school districts, combined the data who made those changes. So after the school start time, there was an increase in the percentage of continuously enrolled children, increase in attendance rate, decline in absenteeism, and decline in tardiness. In addition, they found that first period grades improved, which is a pretty consistent finding because that is the period of the day when adolescents are most prone to be sleepy, and that improved with a later school start time. And then overall, in this study, they did find higher standardized test scores and increases in GPA. I will say that the findings for those variables have been mixed, whereas some findings are really consistent. Like almost everybody finds that kids are getting more sleep. The ones on school performance are variable. Not everybody is finding that, but many schools are. Other outcomes that we see pretty consistently is improvements in mood, health, and typically that's measured with decreased health center visits. I haven't seen it measured in other ways. And then safe driving. So we already went over the Kentucky study, but these are examples of 2 additional districts that published findings on reduction in motor vehicle accidents after the school start change. So Virginia, a comparison. So in Virginia Beach, we started at 720 versus Chesapeake. Initially they were similar. Virginia Beach was 40% higher, the crash rate. And it also peaked an hour earlier, so when kids were on the way to school. And then there was a CDC study that combined data from 3 different states and found a reduction in crash rates by as much as 65 to 70% across 3 states. Okay, so I think another important question is, like, who benefits? So we've been looking a lot at averages, right? And The literature, unfortunately, the scientific literature doesn't do a great job of answering this question yet. There's sort of some findings that I can show you, but they're just a little bit less definitive because for the most part, people have looked at averages, how students are affected as a whole. We do know that most students benefit. So when I give you the averages, if you looked at it in terms of the percentage of students who get more sleep, it's most. So I've been presenting the average, but again, it's impacting most students. You've already seen in the case studies that there are pretty notable increases in the proportion of students who are now getting enough sleep. So it went from maybe 20% to about 50%. And I'll show you a study in a minute that did support that both kids who have really good sleep habits and those who don't have great sleep habits both benefit. So we're not just seeing benefits for the kids who don't have, who have some problematic habits. And then there's some evidence as well that disadvantaged students may benefit more, in part likely because they're at, sometimes at the lower end of the grade distribution or the academic performance, so there's more room to go up. So there is a tendency to see, to think of this as a way to potentially reduce some educational disparities. Okay, so just to summarize sort of the key findings. So increased sleep, improvements in attendance, better academic performance in some but not all, reduced sleepiness, improved mood, increased health and healthy behaviors, and then decreased automobile crash rate. Okay, so what are the benefits of later school start times? Sleep, health, safety, mood, and probably academic performance, but less confident about that. And does 30 to 60 minutes of additional sleep really make a difference? Yes, absolutely. We see this in laboratory studies, and you'll know, and hardly any of the studies have increased the average sleep amounts by more than an hour. So in almost all of these cases and studies, we're looking at an increase of 30 to 60 minutes. And yes, it matters. Okay, so what about other options? So starting school later is not the only way to improve adolescent sleep. So I'm gonna just briefly talk about some other options. So basically, there are a number of curricula that have been studied, a number of programs to sort of educate adolescents about healthy sleep. I don't know if you have, I'm guessing you have a health curriculum in middle and high school, and I don't know if there's a sleep portion of it, but this would be an example. So a lot of these were done in schools, though in one case it was more of just an educational leaflet. And so in general, when you educate adolescents, and some included parents, about sleep, you see the green, you can see that their knowledge improves. So in general, the education does improve students' knowledge about sleep. The problem is that it doesn't often improve, more often than not, it does not improve their actual sleep patterns. So increasingly, we are realizing that education about sleep is not sufficient in a lot of ways. And some of those, I think, relate back to the biological the biological wiring of adolescents, and why even with education and good sleep habits, it's really hard to get enough sleep when you have to wake that early. In terms of sleep habits, I mean, we all know that screens at bedtime are a problem, and that it's fairly widespread. This was a 2014 study where they compared hours of sleep for those who had television at bedtime, and those who didn't got more sleep. Those who didn't have a tablet in their room got more sleep. Even those who didn't have music in their room got more sleep. Which is a little surprising to me because I'm not sure I see music as being as much of a concern. But obviously electronic use matters. So if you can reduce electronic use at bedtime, that's also going to help kids get more sleep. So Judy Owens, who shared a number of these slides with me, did a study where she, in a school start time sample, she compared those who reported using screens before bed, so presumably had some questionable sleep habits, and those who said, no, I don't use screens at bedtime, to see, does one group get, does the school start time change also help kids who have good sleep habits? Does it also help kids who have bad sleep habits? And not surprisingly, one of the things she found is that those who reported electronics before bed did get less sleep before the school start time change. And even after the school start time change, there was still that difference. But the impact of the school start time change was similar between the two groups. So really, these types of policy changes are tending to help kids across the board, even if the sleep habits are problematic. So she concluded that the practice of electronic use before bed doesn't appear to alter the potential benefits of on sleep, of a delay in school start time. Okay, so what about the alternative options? Mixed findings for education. Improving sleep habits helps, but it really could work well as an adjunct, so in addition to a school start time change. Okay, and now we get to how might this change affect younger children? And there just is not nearly as much data on this. I know that there's a lot of data coming out of a project in Denver right now, because I have a colleague who's looking at this issue, and but it's not published yet, so it's not for public consumption. So there will be more, but in terms of what happens when the elementary school kids start school earlier, well, we know they have a greater sleep need compared to adolescents. So we're talking about 9 to, actually, sorry, that's a typo. That was the old one. It should be 9 to 12. I don't remember if it's 9 to 11 or 9 to 12. I could look back in my slides, but they do need more sleep. And there are also factors in elementary school kids that are contributing to insufficient sleep. So activities, media, later bedtimes, earlier rise times. But as opposed to adolescents, they are biologically, environmentally, and socially more amenable to manipulating bedtimes. So with an earlier school start, it's going to be easier to have an elementary school child to move their bedtime earlier and have them actually fall asleep than it is for an adolescent. And is there a sweet spot? And this sweet spot comes from Judy Owens, who is a pretty prominent sleep researcher at Harvard. She said the data are mixed, but there's that probably the sweet spot is for elementary school kids is starting between 7:30 and 9. That studies have shown that when they start around that time, that works well for learning and behavior. There is one study that I found that looked at the impact of school start time changes. So there was a flip between elementary and high school. The high school student, the start time was delayed from 7:30 to 8:15, and the younger students changed from 8:20 to 7:45, so about 35 minutes earlier. This is looking at the different grades. So we'll start by looking at 10th graders. So you can see that with this school start time change, as we've seen in many other studies, the 10th graders got about 35 minutes more sleep as a result of this change. And so let's look at how the change in the opposite direction impacted the elementary school kids. So 3rd graders actually got more sleep when school was moved earlier. We're not really sure why that is, but essentially it's probably parents really pushing earlier bedtimes. And so they were actually getting 24 minutes more sleep. In 4th and 5th graders, the changes were negligible. So they were getting, with the switch, 4 minutes less sleep on average in 4th grade and 9 minutes less sleep on average in 5th grade. And there were no differences in the children's behavior before and after the move to an earlier school start time. So, okay, so how might this change affect younger children? We don't know. We don't have nearly as much data. I think it's coming, but we know definitively that younger children are wired to wake early. So this, an earlier school start time is not misaligned with their biology. And then based on the few studies that have been done, there doesn't appear to be a negative impact in terms of sleep behavior and learning, but preliminary. Okay, so almost done. Barriers to school start times. And I'm going to go through some that are, legitimate barriers and others that people raise as barriers, but that hasn't really been substantiated by the scientific literature. So some of the real barriers with athletics, if you have a school district that is that gets out of school at 4 or at 3:30, and all the other high schools are getting out at 2:30, that's gonna cause some difficulty logistically. Brooke did tell me that many of your adjoining school districts also have made this shift, and so in your case, potentially athletic scheduling becomes less complicated, but it's certainly a consideration. And this is a big one, is potentially, are you now having younger children walking to school in the dark, or because they're going earlier, or standing at bus stops in the dark? And how does that impact their safety? So that is a consideration. Childcare schedules, so in some cases with parent work schedules or with teenagers, are helping to care for the younger ones, either after school or before school. And then again, parental work schedules, so how will that impact parental work schedules? So that's also a consideration. And then potentially local traffic patterns. Barriers that aren't substantiated, and I didn't talk about this evidence, but athletic outcomes are not worse, so teams do not do worse because the games are starting later on. After school activities do not decline. Kids are just as likely to be involved in after school activities and just as likely to get a job. They don't stay up later at night, so that's a barrier we've talked about. And cost as well. Another barrier that was brought up in sort of a preliminary phone call that we made that I wanted to briefly address is how does this impact the household or the family? So if school ends later for a teen, and then activities start later, and they're getting home later, how does that impact family time, right? And that really hasn't been studied to my knowledge. So maybe if the school district does make a switch, maybe that would be a new area to study. So theoretically, if school ends later, there are fewer hours for family time, and I think that's a legitimate consideration. My thoughts to sort of counter that, and again, this is opinion at this point, that if kids are getting more sleep, we know that's associated with better cognitive abilities, more efficiency in tasks like homework. So maybe they're getting homework done more quickly, and that is buying time. Maybe they're wasting less time. That we know they're less likely to nap after school. They may be less likely to sleep in on weekends. That's been mixed. Some studies have found that, some haven't. So that's more family time. And then potentially family time, if you think about quality instead of quantity, family time could be a lot more enjoyable if you have kids who aren't sleep deprived. So again, that's a tough one. There's not a good answer for how does this impact family time. The economic data are much more sort of clear-cut and promising. So the Brookings Institute, which is a major policy institute, estimated that changing high school start times created a lifetime earnings gain of $70,500 per student, and the cost ranged from nothing to about $2,000. So a benefit to cost ratio of 9 to 1. And this was economic modeling of what would happen if the school start times were changed across the board in 47 states. The cost would be $150 per student per year, plus or minus, and then about $100,000 for infrastructure. But if you look at the cost savings, overall, we're estimating about $83 billion to the U.S. economy in 10 years. And this is primarily through decreased automobile crashes and increased rates of high school graduation and university attendance. So again, so this doesn't really say anything about what the cost would be specifically in your district and what the benefits would be, but in general, it's considered an extremely cost-effective way to improve the economy and improve student outcomes. Okay, so the barriers, there's some legitimate structural barriers, and so there is some community adjustment that needs to be considered. Okay, last question, almost done. And this is a quick one. So what are the optimal school start times that support the whole child? That's a little bit harder to answer, especially about elementary school students. The American Academy of Pediatrics has strongly endorsed that schools start at 8:30 or later, so no earlier than 8:30 for both middle schools and high schools. And this is a list of additional organizations that have made that recommendation. This is a study also that looked at sort of different school start times and the percentage of students who were getting at least 8 hours a night. So as we discussed earlier, when schools are starting in that 7:30 zone, you know, only maybe a third to just under a half are getting enough sleep. If you move it to 8, you're getting an increase there. 8:20, you're jumping a little bit. 8:35, you're jumping a little bit. 8:55, you're all of a sudden 2/3 of kids are getting enough sleep. So, you know, again, these are different school districts, but there's some evidence that essentially that the later the better, right? Okay, so what are the optimal school start times? For elementary school, probably in that 7:30 to 9 range. For high school children, all the recommendations, sorry, in middle school, I should have added, say 8:30 or later. My biased opinion would be 9:30, but biased because sleep is what I do, sleep is what I focus on, and so from a sleep standpoint and a sleep health standpoint, I think 9:30 would allow most kids to get the sleep that that they need. But again, that's my biased opinion because that's not considering you know, some of the other structural considerations. So okay, and these are my little ones. Many years ago, they're 11 and 8 right now. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Honaker. I know we all appreciate what our students do sitting through courses like this and delivery and trying to take notes and understand the science. So we really appreciate you taking time from your work at Riley and IU and preparing medical professionals, the next, you know, group of professionals that will help us take care of our children when it comes to sleep. And if you have questions that you want to enter into the chat, we can certainly go through those now. We've also talked about processing this, and I think someone mentioned in here rewatching it and maybe submitting questions that we could email and get a list back together to the committee, because it's a lot to digest, certainly. If there are questions now, feel free to unmute or jump on the chat. You can email Brooke Lawson or Stephanie Lone if you want more time. Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah, please.
It's been brought up anecdotally that our elementary kids, that basically they have 2 learning blocks. Just the way our school's structured. So they have a morning learning block, they have lunch, they have an afternoon learning block. That they are most alert in the morning because once they've had lunch and recess, they kind of lose them. And so, and our kids right now, our elementary kids don't get to school until about 9 o'clock. And then some of them start lunch an hour and 45 minutes later. So there's been anecdotal talk amongst some of us that we are interrupting their best learning block. But I personally don't feel we've done a very good job as a district promoting that. This has all been about adolescents and their sleep. And I just wondered if you had any expert advice or any studies you know of that would help promote that message as well, if that is indeed a true message.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And again, most of the research is focused on the benefits to adolescent sleep. And so we don't have a strong science around elementary. From a sleep perspective, I'm not sure that elementary school age kids would learn worse in the after lunch. I'm certainly not discounting what teachers are reporting anecdotally, but I'm not sure that necessarily matches their natural rhythm. So for example, there wouldn't be a circadian dip where they would be expected to feel more tired later in the day. And if they have only been at school for 3 hours, you wouldn't expect the sleep pressure to be high. So from a circadian standpoint, from a sleep standpoint, I don't know that I have a good explanation for that. So sorry, I don't have a better answer. We just don't.
I'm going to jump in with a couple others here. The disparity between 9th and 12th grade on that slide with the bar graph, puberty or course load?
Probably more course load, because I mean most 9th graders are pubescent, I think. So maybe some of the shift could be biological, but by the time somebody has gone through what we would consider, puberty, they're probably early high school. So my guess is it's less to do with puberty and more to do with course load, extracurriculars, and also parental limit setting. So sometimes for older kids, parents are less likely to be enforcing rules because they're moving towards independence. So we know that that's a factor as well.
Okay, where or how does daylight savings time factor in?
Yeah, there's some pretty strong findings as well to suggest that there's some negative health and sleep impacts of daylight savings. And, so for example, if you look at a time zone, there are differences in sort of sleep and other outcomes from people who are closer to the eastern part of the time zone versus the western at different times of year. So yeah, and then certainly if you're an adolescent and you're having trouble with sleep, that daylight savings is really going to exacerbate your ability for that short period when you're springing forward.
Regarding the risky behavior slide, can you elaborate on the cause and effect of these behaviors? Maybe which came first, the risky behavior which caused the lack of sleep, or the lack of sleep that caused the risky behavior?
That's a really good point. So I'm going back to that. So this is what we call cross-sectional data, meaning that we don't know which came first. And certainly it could be that it's just that adolescents who are more likely to engage in these risky behaviors also are less likely to, or more likely to go to bed late or make other, if you think about going to bed late on a regular basis, that is a sort of a negative health behavior. So it could be that there's sort of this third cause that's causing both the sleep difficulty or the insufficient sleep and the risky behaviors. So I don't think it's all, we can say that sleep definitely causes it, but we do have the laboratory studies that show that on a lesser scale, when we manipulate how much kids are sleeping, it does affect their mood. It does affect sadness and hopelessness. It does affect the way that they think about risky decisions in sort of simulated or gaming. So yeah, so I think we can't totally say that insufficient sleep causes these risky behaviors based on these data, but that they're certainly associated, and then the laboratory findings do provide some support to suggest that at least some of this is caused by insufficient sleep.
Okay, thank you. If there are any others, feel free to jump on or type in now.
I have a question. I started to type it, but it's a little too complicated, so I thought I'd just say it. So the board changed slightly the start time. We weren't quite ready to do a shift in the, or a flip of the times, because we had some additional questions we needed answered. But we shifted it. Unfortunately, the current start time this year is 7:35 for high schools, and it shifted to 7:30. So in essence, we've done the opposite of what the science says. And recognizing that, I've asked that we look at that, relook at that again to shift it at least 5 minutes back to 7:35, so they aren't starting earlier. We have gotten some pushback, some of us who are in favor of that would shift the elementary time 5 minutes. It would shift all the times, but basically elementary, instead of starting at 9, would start at 9:05. And the pushback we received is that's pitting the high schoolers versus the elementary kids. What's your thoughts on that? Is the shift of 5 minutes more beneficial for high school? Is it negative for elementary? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess there are two questions. I mean, one, I guess, is does 5 minutes make a difference? And either way, does the 5 minutes matter? And I don't know, because a lot of these studies have looked at changes that were sort of at a minimum 20 minutes. I certainly think, 5 minutes is 5 minutes is potentially 5 minutes. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly not going to hurt, and it's a move in the right direction. In terms of how it affects the elementary school students, again, we don't know, but they're wired to be awake earlier. That is sort of their biological tendency, and we really see kids struggle with sleep when they transition from from elementary to middle school. And these kids who are currently elementary students are going to be middle schoolers and high schoolers, right? And so, and the benefits for the older students are so profound that if you're looking from a risk benefit, the risk to elementary school students, there doesn't appear to be negative outcomes, because hardly any districts have switched back, is the other piece. If you look at the districts who have made the switch, in most cases, they're pretty pleased with it. But again, we don't really know as well how it, I mean, we can't say for sure, that it's not going to negatively affect the elementary school kids. There are a lot of reasons why it might not, or most kids will be fine, but will it affect some? And we can't say, no, it definitely won't.
Okay, thank you. Is there any concern that moving high schoolers to a later time will make it harder for them to adjust to an 8 to 5 workplace later in life?
Yeah, I don't think so. And the reason is that the circadian delay on average starts to improve for boys when they're around 25 and for girls around 22. And so, this is something that kids are going to be dealing with, in college and at work. But there's not really any evidence, if you're doing something that isn't good for you, there's not really any evidence that it'll be less harmful if you start sooner, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And then colleges, I think, also shouldn't be starting at 8 or 7. That also sort of goes against that, the way that kids are wired.
That whole age group. Okay, thank you. Is there any data to say how the changes in start time or benefits would benefit students with special needs or may not benefit students with special needs?
That's a great point. We don't know. I don't know of any studies that have looked at that. So that would be another area that potentially you guys could look at if you made the change. I will say that kids with autism tend to have more of a delayed circadian phase than typically developing kids. And in general, kids with special needs, in particular developmental special needs versus more physical, like developmental disorders, are more likely to have sleep problems and disrupted sleep, and more likely to have circadian disruption. So I would guess that those kids would potentially benefit even more from the change, but we don't know.
Okay, thank you. Please jump in or type in any questions.
Can you explain the lifetime earnings differences? What accounts for the difference? Higher education or?
Yeah, I think it's mostly because of the increases in high school graduation rates, the increases in students attending college, and then a big one is decrease in car crashes, which can be very expensive with medical treatments, and brain injuries are extremely difficult and expensive. It was those three factors that they looked at, that they based that 83 billion estimate on.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for your attention. Dr. Borf, I'll turn it back over to you. And thanks again, Dr. Honaker, so much. If we should receive more questions, we'll be sure to email those out to you and try to get the best response that we can. And again, we really appreciate your time this evening.